Today we're going to start our look at the Great Depression by examining some of the causes that would lead to the Great Depression. First, it's important to mention that there was no one cause of the Great Depression. Instead, it was a combination of a number of factors, a number of aspects of American life and the American economy that started to suffer and all together would lead to the Great Depression. As we move through the 1920s, industries in the United States began to suffer. First of all, their profits start to decline. During World War I and in the years immediately following, profits were incredibly high for industry. They were asked to produce a lot to help with the war effort. They were asked to produce a lot immediately following the war as European nations had to rebuild first. But as we move through the 1920s, that demand decreases, so the profits of those industries also decrease. Also, foreign industries start to catch up to the level of the United States. Prior to the end of the 1920s, the U.S. was a world leader in manufacturing, in industry. And even though they were still a world leader at the end of the 1920s, other nations are starting to catch up and are providing more competition to U.S. industries. Railroads started to suffer as we moved towards the end of the 1920s. They faced new competition. Trucks and cars, the creation of the highway system provide a lot of competition for the railroads. And as railroads start to suffer, they manufacture less railroad engines and cars. They lay less railroad track, which affects other industries, especially the steel industry. Also, housing construction at the end of the 1920s started to decline also. And housing is another one of those industries that is a good indicator of how well the economy is doing. If we're building a lot of new homes, lots of industries are doing well. The lumber industry that's providing the lumber for building the homes, the concrete industry, the industries that are manufacturing the items that go into the home, furniture and appliances. But as new house construction starts to decline, those various industries start to suffer as well. By the end of the 1920s, farmers are also in trouble and are suffering. In fact, they suffered more than most other aspects of American life and American economy. Just like industry, during World War I, farmers were expected to produce a lot. They were producing to support the war effort, and many farmers took out loans to purchase additional equipment and land. They planted in excessive amounts to try to produce as much as possible and maximize their profits. Following the war, there's more being produced on farms than is needed. As a result, prices start to decrease. Demand has also decreased. Now farmers are not making as much for the crops by the end of the 1920s as they were during the World War I era. To try to amend this, farmers try to produce even more. What that ends up doing is driving prices even lower. There's more and more and more available on the market, more than is needed, and as a result, prices decrease. Farmers struggle to pay off the debts that they incurred during World War I when they purchased more equipment and more land. And as a result, farmers really struggle through the 1920s and into the Great Depression. Congress proposed passing price supports for farmers. That is, buying products from the farmers, buying the excess products that they're producing and selling them on the world market, trying to support the farmers by providing them a fair price for what they're producing. But President Coolidge vetoed this, and he was quoted as saying, "Farmers have never made money, and I don't believe we can do much about it." As we move through the 1920s, consumers also struggle. For the average person in the United States, through the 1920s, their wages did not rise as much as the prices of the goods that they were buying. So many people resorted to buying on credit. That is, paying a small portion for an item now and then paying over time for the remainder of the cost of that item. As a result, consumers built up a lot of debt, and by the end of the 1920s, many consumers throughout the United States had created a large amount of debt that they were not likely to pay off. As we move through the 1920s, there's also a problem of economic equality in the United States. We talked during the Roaring Twenties about what a prosperous time it was, and it was for some Americans. But for many Americans, their standard of living did not improve greatly during the 1920s. And by the end of the 1920s, the wealthiest 5% of Americans earned 1/3 of the nation's income annually or yearly. The poorest 40% made only 1/10 of the nation's income. So, in a way, the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer. At the end of the 1920s, $2,500 a year was considered the minimum amount for a good standard of living. And at this time, 70% of Americans made less than $2,500 a year, meaning that 70% of Americans did not make enough money to maintain a quality standard of living. During the 1920s, one aspect of the American economy that really prospered was the stock market. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is used to gauge how healthy or how well the stock market's doing. It looks at a range of various businesses, looks to see how they're doing, and uses it to gauge how well the rest of the economy is doing. And through the 1920s, the Dow Jones Industrial Average rose to its greatest levels. So, in effect, the stock market was doing very well. But there are some problems beneath the surface that show some flaws in the stock market. One was people buying on speculation, meaning they were buying risky stocks and hoping for a quick profit. Buy something that was high risk potentially means high reward. The problem is, if that risk doesn't play out, if the reward doesn't come, most investors were not able to pay off what they owed on that stock. They were counting on making quick money on that stock and using that quick money to pay off what they owed for the rest of it. Another problem was buying on margin, meaning paying a small percent for a stock up front and hoping to pay off the rest of it down the road with the profits made from that stock. Very similar to buying on credit or using the installment plan that many consumers used. Another issue or problem was that at this time there is absolutely no government regulation of the stock market. Companies could send out false reports. They could encourage investors to purchase stocks that were incredibly risky and were likely not going to result in a profit. All of these issues and problems have developed throughout the 1920s. And at the end of the 1920s, in the 1928 election, President Hoover is elected. He's elected in 1928 and becomes president in 1929. At the time when he was elected, President Hoover was one of the most recognizable and respected individuals in politics in the United States. He had served in the government for more than a decade, had been a very successful businessman, and had proven his business skills and ability. But at the time he's elected, we have all of these problems that have been developing throughout the 1920s. So even though things look prosperous on the surface, just beneath there's a lot of issues, a lot of problems that Hoover and later Roosevelt and the American people will have to deal with. All of these problems finally boil over at the end of 1929. It actually started a little bit earlier, at the beginning of September in 1929. Stock prices peaked, they were at their highest levels, and then fell abruptly. As a result, a number of investors sold their stocks, worrying that they were going to be losing even more money. But the stock market maintained and held for a little over a month, about a month and a half. Then on October 24th, the market took another plunge, and investors in a wave unload a number of their stocks and shares. The following Tuesday, on October 29th, which we now refer to as Black Tuesday, the prices on the stock market, prices of stocks, plummet, and people frantically try to unload all of their stocks. As a result, by mid-November, about half a month later, investors in the United States had lost approximately $30 billion in half a month. $30 billion, which is roughly equal to the amount of money the United States spent on World War I. So all of the prosperity that we talked about during the Roaring '20s had a lot of issues beneath the surface. And by the end of the 1920s, by November of 1929, the stock market has crashed. All of these issues are going to come to the forefront. And as we move into the 1930s, President Hoover has a lot of issues to face. A lot of problems that he most likely did not anticipate having to deal with.